Our transportation contributor, Todd Curtis, he's a pilot and an expert on airplane security. He joins us live from Newton, Massachusetts. So Todd, a lot of questions on this. I'm hoping you can help us break it down. The first one is this term deliberate action the Malaysian Prime Minister is using, wanting to avoid the term hijacking. I'm trying to figure out how this could be justified in a pilot's mind, turning off these different forms of communication, diverting the plane. How could it be anything but a hijacking?
Well, I think the Prime Minister was correct in using the term deliberate action, because that part, I think it's fairly agreed upon that some action had to be taken by the pilot. The big question is why? And again, the answer to that question will determine whether or not this was a hijacking by a third party, that is someone outside of the cockpit, a commandeering of the aircraft by the crew for reasons having nothing to do with completing their mission.
But in all your years flying, Todd, in all of your years working with planes, can you think of a legitimate reason why a pilot would do the things this pilot apparently did?
I can think of legitimate reasons why they were doing things that are completely off script. That is, if there were a series of system issues in the aircraft, systems failing, systems putting out bad data, other unusual activities, the pilots could be using emergency checklists, or what they call a non-normal checklist if it's less than an emergency, to try and isolate a problem, to try and cut off machinery that's not behaving. And perhaps, and this is speculation, perhaps things were progressively failing, and the pilots had to do something very creative, very much outside of the normal procedures to try and save the airplane. So I think, again, getting back to the Prime Minister's words, a deliberate action, yes, but a deliberate action for malicious reasons, that remains to be seen.
And what do you make of the stunning revelation that we heard overnight and into today that this plane continued flying for 7 hours? One of the first things I'm thinking is that when Malaysia should have been aware that its plane was missing, there's a chance that the plane was still in the air and that the passengers were still alive.
Indeed, in fact, after 7 hours of flight, they may have still been alive. And again, without knowing what was going on inside of the aircraft, it's hard to say what was going on. Either the crew was not communicating with the outside world because they didn't want to communicate with the outside world, or because they were unable to communicate. A system failure. Perhaps the crew and the passengers were incapacitated, and the plane was on some sort of autopilot routing to go to their destination.
But again, just knowing that the plane, but let me ask you, Todd, just knowing that the plane continued flying for 7 hours after its last known contact, do you feel like the Malaysian authorities, the Malaysian government, are handling this well? Do you think that there should have been earlier alarms that went off somewhere within Malaysia's government to say, hey, we're missing this plane, we need to try to find it?
Well, I think in the early stages, very early stages, that they reacted accordingly. When the airplane didn't show up at its destination, a search was initiated. A search in the reasonable areas was initiated. But one must keep in mind, the last 7 days are clearly without precedent, at least in the last 30 or 40 years of civil aviation. Even in cases where an aircraft was lost for several days, as was the case with the Air France event in 2009. There was debris found after 5 days, and at least at that point, there was some assurance that the airplane was no longer in one piece and that perhaps it had crashed. After 7 days, there's nothing. No debris, no sighting of the aircraft, no survivors calling in, nothing. So given that this is a situation where many things can be happening, and that this government, to the best of their ability, they're trying to keep this in control and get a consortium of countries to work with them. Sure, one can point fingers at the Malaysian government saying, well, maybe they should have done something differently, but let's go back to the basic fact here. This is a very, very unusual situation. Any country would have been tasked very heavily to deal with this.
Okay, Todd Curtis, our transportation contributor, talking to us from Massachusetts today. Thank you for your insight. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Jonathan.